Okay. So I think we're good to get started. So thanks a lot for joining this webinar. It's the second in a series that looks into debunking a lot of quote unquote solutions that are proposed for tackling climate change. And now we're going to be focusing on a lot of false land-based activities that are promoted by industry as addressing climate change. And we'll get into the speakers and what we'll talk about in just a little bit. If we can go to the next slide. So this is organized by the Real Zero Europe Coalition. So we are addressing all of the false solutions or dangerous distractions, as we call them, to addressing climate change. And we want to promote what will actually decarbonize the European economy. So we're a campaign that's calling on the European Union to focus on the actions that work and to avoid corporate greenwash solutions that are proposed to achieve net zero. We're about real zero and getting the emissions down to zero in the end. So thanks a lot for joining the call. And if you have more questions about Real Zero Europe, I'm sure we can pop a link to, I mean, you see it here, www.realzeroeurope.org, to find more about the organizations that are associated with this coalition. Next slide, please. So a couple of house rules. You should see at the bottom that there is a Q&A function for you to ask your questions. The speakers should be able to respond both in the chat and we'll have a little section for questions to be directed to the various speakers. And yeah, we will address as many as we can over the course of the time that we have together. The webinar is going to be recorded. You should have seen something at the top of your screen at the start of the webinar, and it will be made online for any colleagues that wanted to attend and were not able to today. Next. And so here we have our speakers for today. We're going to start with Joanna Cabello from SOMO, who's going to talk about carbon offsets. Sophie Scherger is unfortunately ill today, but there are many elements of specifically land-based offsets from agriculture and forestry that Joanna is going to cover a little bit in her presentation. Then I'm going to talk about the industrial forestry model and how that plays into discussions around the climate targets today. Almuth Ernsting from Biofuelwatch will get into the details of biochar, what it is, what it can and cannot do. And Frederic Hache is with Green Finance Observatory, and he will jump into the issue of biodiversity offsets. So a lot on offsets, a lot on land. So I hope you learn a lot from this discussion, and throw your questions in the chat if you have them. But with that being said, I think we can already move to our first presenter, Joanna, who will give us an introduction to carbon offsets and the long and riddled history behind them. Go ahead, Joanna.
Thank you. I am trying to set up everything. I hope you see it correctly.
We see it in a presentation format where you see like your first and your next slide that's upcoming.
Oh yeah, right. How do you change that though? I'm not sure how to change that right now, but I think that's okay. If that doesn't bother everybody, I can do this. Okay, I'll just get started to not lose more time. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. And thank you, Kelsey, for the presentation and for introducing us to this webinar. As I'm the first presenter, I am going to talk about the more kind of general framework of what is land-based fall solutions focusing on carbon offsets. So it is more about going into the logic. I will discuss what is actually carbon and what is actually an offset, and what are the main assumptions of offset projects. Why do we think this is a fall solution, and why we should be worried about them? So I'll just get straight to the first part of things. So when we talk about carbon offsets, there is two things that I think is important to reflect upon. And I'm sure some of you and many of you know a little bit about this or a lot about this, but it's important, I think, to always reflect on this and not get caught into the narrative of just talking about this without thinking deeply on what do we mean by this and what are the assumptions that we are holding by saying these things. So when we talk about carbon, I mean carbon dioxide as the main one of the main greenhouse gases that is causing the climate crisis. We know that this is obviously coming. The main driver of this is the extraction and production of fossil fuels, but it's also released by large-scale deforestation, which is tied to the agro industry. But it's also released in, for example, the use of wood for cooking in small scales. So all of these activities, let's call it like this, release carbon dioxide. So the question is really, is all carbon dioxide the same? At the end of the day, it is a molecule, right? And molecules should be the same nonetheless. So because of that, I think it is important to try to see the political aspect of it, right? And for that, let's just go a little bit on understanding what is this carbon dioxide. So we know that there is like the carbon that is around with us above ground, which is between atmosphere and oceans and all the trees and the soils and different ecosystems. And then there is what we call the fossil carbon, which is locked underground, and it cannot be above ground unless humans, with big machinery, make a lot of effort to take this out of the underground. So these carbons are not the same. So one is what we call biotic carbon, and the other one is what is called fossil carbon. You can bring the fossil carbon very quickly and in large quantities to the biotic carbon, to the atmosphere, but you cannot do the same in the same tempo from when you want to bring the carbon from the atmosphere to the underground. That took millions of years to happen. So there are all these equivalences that are made kind of almost, randomly, that are not being discussed in the negotiations, in the climate talks. One of the most obvious is the one that I was just talking about, which is between fossil and biotic carbon, which actually it's at the center, is at the heart of what is the offset industry, because the offset industry basically now with the new narratives is the net zero emissions, right? And the net is about equivalences. This is equal to this, so I can absorb X amount of carbon, and then that will be the same as releasing X amount of carbon. And all these equivalences are just done as if it would be something just given. We know, and it has been already debunked many times in scientific studies, that this is definitely not the same. And what is happening is that we are accumulating more carbon rapidly in the atmosphere by unlocking the fossil carbon that is underneath. So when we say all carbon is not the same, we mean mainly also that we have to remember ourselves that even though it is a molecule, what it is talked about, their impacts and how it shows up in the world is not on molecule basis, it's on real basis and has real impacts on people. So this, for example, is a factory in India, which is an offset project that is supposed to be doing good and earning carbon credits, but nonetheless is having a lot of impacts on the people and the population that live around this factory. This is oil spills in Nigeria from the company Shell, which has extensively used offset credits to claim neutrality on their fuels. Nonetheless, their impacts are very real and disastrous for communities and the territories where they are extracting fuel. And on the last photo, it is a community from Thailand, in Mae Thai, who has seen their territory enclosed for a conservation park, which will be used for carbon offset. So for them, it is very real that this molecule is being absorbed, is being transformed into an asset that will be sold to another company, so that they and because of that they can be evicted of their territory. So the point is to kind of politicize what carbon means, and to try to think of it not as a molecule, not as something that is the same. It's actually a very convenient abstraction for this whole climate talks, because it doesn't allow us to talk about fossil fuels. It prevents us to talk about the histories of colonialism and capitalism and all the difficult transformations that we would need to make in order to actually address the climate crisis. So the second part of this is, what is an offset project, right? So mainly, an offset project is a project that claims to reduce, remove, or avoid emissions that are additional to what would have happened without the project. So, you know, I'm sure all of you know this, but it is important to pay attention to the narrative again. So the projects claim to be reducing emissions or removing emissions or avoiding emissions, and they have to be additional to this. We will discuss this additionality later. So the basic idea is that these projects generate carbon credits that are sold in the carbon markets, and each carbon credit claims to be equal to 1 ton of CO2. So the amount of CO2 that this project claims to be reducing or removing or avoiding is translated into X amount of carbon credits that then are put into the market for buyers to be able to buy them. So basically, the general lines, you know, what do offsets allow is to break any possible cap. So where there could be a cap, let's call it a target or a limit or any sort of, you know, a limit that a company can put, or a government can put, or even a region can put or a municipality, any actor that could do. When you buy offset credits, you are allowing that limit to be broken, so that, you know, you allow more pollution that in theory is compensated by projects that are being made elsewhere, right? So in consequence, what we produce is a system or a logic. So we're basing climate policy on a logic that allows pollution to increase as long as there is a project that is claiming to do an equal amount of reductions or avoidance or removals. So carbon offsets do not reduce emissions. In the very best case or theoretical case, it's a zero-sum game. So I emit, I compensate, but it's not reducing. Materially, there is much more pollution. We're just claiming to be offsetting this extra pollution. Okay. Okay. So when we think about carbon in a more political sense, and we think about offsets, in how the logic of offsets is not to actually prevent more pollution to come to the atmosphere, but, you know, but to allow this pollution to happen, but putting some offset projects in place, then we have to look about the assumptions of how this logic functions. How did this come to be? And I start with the social assumptions, because I think are the least reported upon in, you know, media, although there has been much more media attention in the last years. But I think even in the policy debates or in the climate discussion negotiations at the UN level, this is not always put as the first part. It is more about the technical flaws of the carbon commodity, which is kind of the thing that makes the money run. But I think the social impacts are the most important things to highlight here. Because one aspect that, at least for me, is very important to say is, every land-based offset project that is on community land usually blame these communities for the deforestation or degradation that happens. And this is because, you know, in order for a project to be approved by the registries, they have to claim that without the project, that forest would have been deforested. This area would have been degraded or, you know, changed in some way. And because normally the land-based projects that are on forests are on actual forests that are standing and thriving, they have to look for a way or a justification to claim that that project is additional, that it actually makes sense that they enter and fund this project and do this offsetting. Oh, that's what I just, there has to be a risk, right? Without this risk, the offset project does not have the legitimacy to exist. Another important things are the contracts. Every offset project that are based on community land, in any way or shape, have to sign some contract between the developer and the community or the family or the cooperative or whatever construction that is on the other side. But these contracts are usually very, first, they are very private and there is no transparency in the industry because they have normally a clause that says that the community should not show the contracts or cannot, disseminate to anybody. So it is difficult to get hold of contracts. But what we know is that contracts are usually running from 20, 50 to 100 years. So the impacts are not just for the present generation, but it's even longer. It usually involves restrictions, either that the communities cannot enter the forest, or they cannot practice the same activities, the same agricultural activities, or they cannot do their traditional systems of fire or whatever that is. And that brings surveillance, because if they are restricted to do what they used to do, someone needs to enforce these new rules. And that brings a lot of problems in terms of even violence. And there's a lot of research now on the lack of real free, prior, and informed consent that has not happened with communities. So I could go more and more on this, but just to not lose more time, there is a lot of problems on the land control and the amount of land that it's under offset projects. So this is just one research from Grain that is looking only on the industrial plantations under offset projects. And you see, for example, that Asia has the most projects, but when you see it on the terms of land, Africa has way more land covered under offset projects. And that brings a question on who is controlling this land and for what purposes, because the carbon rights have been sold, so communities don't have the autonomy anymore to decide over this land or crops. So these are the social aspects, but then there are, of course, the technical assumptions and all these things that are supposed to happen in order for the credit to be valid credit. One is the additionality that we mentioned, that it has to be something that would not have occurred without the project. And this is crucial for the integrity of the project. Without additionality, in theory, there should not be an offset project, because this would have happened. What is the offset compensation that you're doing if that project was anyways going to happen, right? But then you have permanence, and that means, like I was saying, the contract go for 20, 50, 100 years. How can you or anyone ensure that either a forest or a plantation or an agricultural project can remain for that long in a context of increasing climate change that put those same territories at risk, but also can be policy changes or resistance or anything that could make this land use change differently. So it is almost impossible to ensure and guarantee for that amount of years. And the third technical assumption is leakage, which is supposed to say, okay, I do this offset project, nobody deforests here, but then deforestation goes elsewhere. And that is really increasing because the offset and the carbon offsets in general are not tackling the drivers of what is creating in this case, for example, deforestation. So they just try to avoid deforestation in the places where the trees are standing, but the drivers of the deforestation are still running. So they move somewhere else. And of course, there is another important part, which is the conflicts of interest. So the industry, the offset industry, is in the voluntary market, is mainly run by the registries, the auditors, and the project developers. But these three actors have a lot of incentive to always greenlight projects and give more credits than actually are generated by a project because they all earn money from this. So the industry in itself is riddled by conflicts of interest. And this can also be said for the current regulatory markets, where auditors are the ones supposed to check that things are going okay. But when you see that the auditors are being hired by those that are developing the projects, then you anyway see that the same conflicts of interest happen. So what we see is that offsets mean a double land grab, right? We see, I mean, from the very conception of it, we see that there is the fossil carbon, the one type of fossil, which is coming up from the underground by the extraction, the fossil fuel extraction, and generating lots of impact in terms of land and health and communities' autonomy. And then on the other hand, we have the biotic carbon, which is the offset projects in land-based. And they are also generating a lot of social impacts because these need land to be used for the specific purpose of creating the carbon credits. So my conclusion is that the offset story is mainly a solution for the polluting industries and big oil corporations. They can continue their business without massive changes, and they can continue profiting from this without having to stop. And even more worrisome when they are the drivers of the climate crisis, right? So these are not just a false solution, although that's already big, but they reinforce this crisis. They reinforce it by allowing more pollution. They reinforce the local injustices by claiming so much land and doing all these contracts and imposing restrictions. And they also obstruct other real alternatives to be central in the agenda of climate policy, because of course, you know, this has been used from the UN to the EU to, you know, most of the countries now in the global south having this policy, this in their climate policy or environmental policies, because it is very corporate friendly. I will stop now to have more time for questions and for the other panelists. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Joanna. That's a lot of information packed into your slides. So I'm looking quickly at the Q&A. I don't see any questions that have come in yet. People may have to chew on all of that information. But I mean, maybe I can ask a question to see if that spurs some people in the audience to also contribute their own questions. But why do you think this idea keeps getting resurrected? This has been a multi-decade false, dangerous distraction. And it keeps coming back despite investigative journalism, academics, think tanks outlining the problems, the social and environmental problems with this approach. So what are your views on its zombie-like nature?
Thank you, Kelsey. Good question. I mean, it is interesting when you see it historically how this tool has been evolving. We have first the CDM with the Clean Development Mechanism in the Kyoto Protocol, and that was a complete failure. And it was clear by research and even UN recognizing the limits of what was accomplished by the CDM. And then, you know, we have experiences like the EU ETS, which allowed, you know, offsets at the beginning, and them themselves realizing this is a bad idea. Price went down, it was a total chaos. So they took it out and didn't allow it to come back into the policy. And now it's coming back, or there is a threat for it to come back, which is nonsense in my view, how we are not learning from mistakes, but we're actually, as you say, resurrecting a policy that has proven over and over to fail. The fact that we have most of offsets in the voluntary carbon market is also telling. Regulators were not able to agree because of the controversies, and those controversies are extremely valid, continue to be the same controversies, but the market kind of developed outside of any regulation so that they can just push pilot projects and do their own sort of rules. And therefore we have a scandal after scandal, right?
Thanks for that. I have seen a question come in now from Maya. What are the ways to respond to industry advocates that view such projects as a simple calculation for carbon in projects? I hope I've captured the view on that. And I will just add on, because she's added a caveat, adding on to my question. Industry respondents often include ESG reports that show certain risk mitigations relating to communities, but are still continuing the same harmful practices. Is this a matter of simply trying to change perspectives? So maybe you can address both of those comments.
Thank you, Maya, for the question. On the first part of the question, I think that's why I thought it was important to start with what do we mean by carbon, and to really think through that we are not doing a mathematical equation here. That climate is much more complicated and part of a more longer process of history and how we embed our economies. Because when we see it just as carbon plus, carbon mean, you do a mathematical equation, then it's easy to abstract ourselves from the reality and from the world, from the territories, from where actually this carbon is embodied. So I would suggest, when talking with industry players or policymakers especially, to go into these nuances of where does this carbon come from? What does it mean? And why are we talking about carbon in the first place? Should we be talking about carbon in the first place, or should we be talking about something else? So that is why I chose to start there, because I think that is something that happens a lot in the discussions. And on the second question, I mean, I think there is a lot of people that have very good intentions in the industry and trying to do more safeguards and trying to, do the best in terms of not having impacts for communities. But unfortunately, the design of the industry is not made for any of these standards to cover the underlying injustice that this scheme is made for doing. So when you are going to a community and say, okay, we are going to tell you to change your agricultural practices, and we're going to make that you have capacity building and build you some schools, who is actually making that calculation of value? Because someone else is actually earning a lot of money by doing that. But they are convincing communities that by having some schools and having this capacity building, that is a compensation of them not having total ownership of their territories. There is not one community in my experience that have full awareness of what it meant to sign these contracts in the long term, right?
So I see one more question that has come through. In your perspective, should we still stick to neutrality targets? What could really help to prevent these sort of offsetting practices?
I mean, the language for me needs to change, but just because now neutrality means offsetting in some ways, I think that we need to talk about real zero. If, we go back to the basis, we need to talk about reducing emissions, not how to compensate emissions. We have far, far beyond the moment that we could talk about easy solutions that accompany the long-term solutions. Now is the time to act. We need to start thinking of how we can stop or phasing out fossil fuels in an equitable way. We can't give them more years that they just play us around saying that they're doing something when they are not. So it is very important that we are all understanding that this narrative of net zero, neutrality, carbon neutral, all of these terms are just allowing the system to not do any of the real changes. So if we want change to be seen, we need to change the narrative so that practices can also change.
That's a great way to wrap up that section. Just a quick check with my panelist colleagues. Are we covering any of Sophie's slides, or are we moving directly to the next presentation?
I will be jumping in for Sophie. So
okay.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Then I think that's we've answered all the questions. So that's the movement into the land-based offsets and EU climate policy, where RZE is a flat coalition, so we often jump in for each other and on different subjects. So go ahead, Joanna.
Thank you, Kelsey. And a caveat that I'm not, the expert on agriculture as Sophie is, but, we thought that it's really an important subject to cover, and we can totally try to bring the main message that she wanted to bring to you guys. So, as part of these land-based offset projects, we now talk about farming carbon, which sounds crazy, but it's part of this. So land-based offsets mostly, but not exclusively, rely on the land's ability to sequester and store carbon. So we have three ways of carbon farming: the peatland rewetting, agriculture, and forestry. And forestry we will discuss later on with Kelsey as well. And this presentation is focused on agriculture. So we know that the EU certifies carbon farming offsets. There is an idea that is called the EU Carbon Removal and Carbon Farming Certification Framework. Well, it's more than an idea, it's actually a policy now, which means that polluters can buy credits that are generated by farmers and foresters that are sequestering carbon through different practices. So that's the idea. It's meant to provide a new revenue stream for these farmers and foresters and move from public to private finance. So it should increase carbon sequestration and, in theory, emission reductions in the agriculture and land sectors. But what is the difference between the idea and the reality, right? Carbon sequestration in land sinks is not permanent, as I was speaking in the previous presentation, but it's reversible. So it can worsen the climate crisis. Why? Because when there is flooding or drought or increased temperatures or crops do not behave in the way that they used to behave, well, the capturing of the carbon can be reversed, right? And released again into the atmosphere. And this is difficult and very costly to measure reliably. So there is poor monitoring and verification protocols. And this is really especially important for all land-based offsets because nature behaves differently, and especially in the framework and the context of climate change. It's hard to prove being additional. That's also what we discussed before. More so in nature and land use, because things change and could have been changing for different reasons and not necessarily because an offset project comes across. So how do we prove that this is the reason? Has not the scale to compensate for the immense amount of ongoing emissions. There is no land on Earth that could compensate all the emissions that we keep on releasing to the atmosphere. So we can't rely on that. Has no one-to-one relationship between industrial sources of emissions. So you cannot make that equivalence that we were talking. And does not approach agriculture and forestry transition holistically. Basically, these offsets are not making the transformation that we should be talking about when we talk about how to think about an agriculture in a sustainable way. So basically, it is handing out license to pollute. So it creates false equivalences between cutting pollution at source and cleaning up afterwards. It is at best a zero-sum game. It puts us in a carbon tunnel vision in land-based projects that leaves other important issues behind that are fundamental to the health of ecosystem. So we don't see anything else but carbon, and that's true for almost every sector. When we relied on these carbon policies, we just don't talk about anything else, and it becomes a mathematical equation, right? And it risks increasing pressure on land. And that is, we have to realize that the carbon credits has a lot of volatility in their prices. So one moment it can be very high and the other moment it can be very low. And that will affect, if we rely on carbon as being the incentive for specific practices, that will impact massively on the land and the land pressure. Okay, so is there soon a future of EU climate policy? Here, IATP did 3 possibilities for EU climate policy on the agricultural sector. So the option 1 that we see on the left is where farmers generate their carbon credits and they sell it to either the member state or the European Commission, and they put it into a pool of credits for selling into the market. This is a bit of a mix between the public and the voluntary offset markets. Then the middle one is what we call the EU ETS agriculture. So the emission trading scheme in the agriculture sector, which is basically putting a cap and then allowing the industries to trade among themselves, but they are also thinking of allowing offsets. So that would break the cap, right? And the third one is mandatory climate targets for the meat and the dairy processors or retailers. And that sounds better in theory, but at the end, it also would allow those that would, reduce more than the target to sell these extra reductions as certificates for those that could not do it. So in a way, we are falling into the same logic. So any of these policies might allow polluters to rely on carbon sequestration to substitute for emission reduction. So none of them basically are incentivizing for a transformation or a real reduction of the sector. So will the EU rely on land elsewhere? So there is consideration, we mentioned before, of allowing international carbon credits to achieve the EU 2040 climate target. The international offsets were previously excluded. But now they are starting to get into this. We have seen press releases and intentions from the Commission to allow international offsets. So the scope and the type of the credits are still uncertain. We don't know, but it is very certain that they will allow to an extent. And we have that of course, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. There is the UN climate negotiations where all of this is negotiated at the global level. There we have what is called the Article 6.2 and the Article 6.4. And these two articles are the core of what the carbon markets get inserted into the climate policy. So the Article 6.2 is where the countries can trade credits between themselves. But if you see properly what the UN says in their own website, it's not countries only. It's project developer and its entities. It's basically allowing or opening the door for anyone to develop a project or buy a credit. And therefore, merging the regulatory with the voluntary carbon market. And that is very, there is a lot of concern on this, because when the EU talks about merging voluntary carbon markets with regulatory markets, that means that the actors that are supposed to be under a certification scheme in the EU can also have access to the voluntary carbon markets, and therefore making more loopholes in what is supposed to be a more regulated sector. So this is a lot of concern. There is a lot of concern on this. And we already overly rely on land for this. So these are some figures of land area that are pledged for these carbon dioxide removals in what the countries have submitted to the UNFCCC, which is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So we say, for example, that 30% of the total land pledge compared to global arable land is 30%, which is a lot. It's a lot of land for this that is pledged. So something on these numbers, so that I don't read them all, that I found interesting is, so all the countries have to submit a pledge, which is called nationally determined contributions to the UN, to say how they are going to do what they are claiming they will do. And only 16 countries include no land-based CDR in their climate policies. Only 16. That means that all the countries in the world are relying to an extent on land-based removals. And that's really concerning due to all the lacks and the gaps and the flaws that we have seen already for 20 years. We're not talking about theories. We're talking about something that we can already study and rely. So land is a critical piece of the puzzle, but cannot absolve us from cutting greenhouse gas emissions in the first place. And this is what I was talking before as well. Even though, you know, you can think of, oh, it seems like a good idea, we could try to solve it. We're past that. We now need to actually demand real reductions. We can't say nowadays, oh, we can use this at the same time that we give time for the transition. No, the time of this transition is now, right? So that was the presentation from Sophie. I'm sure I have not made justice to what she wanted to present, but we didn't want to take away the agricultural aspect from this presentation.
Thanks very much for stepping in, Joanna. No, I think it's important that we show the way that solutions in the agriculture sector are being considered. And I see that we have sort of a comment in the chat from Judith that says, I think it's very important to note that the CRCF is not yet in place. The methodologies are not finalized, which is good from an advocacy perspective. Then we can push to say relying on offset methodologies is not a reliable way forward. I do believe the timeline for the first methodologies that are being considered is spring of next year. So there's a lot of debate. I think we're starting with bioenergy and carbon capture and storage as a first methodology. While we wait to see if there are any questions on the agricultural offsets, I think I just wanted to reflect on the fact that in order to reach targets, when you look at the policy solutions, they're getting more and more convoluted. You know, the graphs are getting more and more complex as we go on through time. And I think that points to the fact that there's a lot of haggling and negotiating to say, I'll continue my practices today, but then maybe in the future, you can give me an IOU and, you know, I'll compensate for what I've done farther down the line. But I think we can see that this hasn't been the type of promise that has led to changing the trajectory of emissions for the land use sector so far. So this is definitely a concern I noted in looking at some of the graphs of Sophie's presentation.
Yes, I agree. It took me a while also to go into the details. I was trying to, to read before, and it's really interesting how, all the policies that are being proposed nowadays, even at the UN level, is a mixture of this and that and that and that, and trying to join regulatory and voluntary and doing these things. I think something that we should always bear in mind that no matter the regulation, at the end of the day, this whole industry is based on the same logic. So, either if it's regulated by a state or if it's an auditor or a voluntary-based registry, the logic of trying to compensate pollution remains. So if we have that kind of clear vision, then we can see where we should be putting our demands.
Absolutely. So I see that we don't have a lot of questions. I mean, also to follow up on some of the details, then Sophie from IATP is always contactable for some of the questions there. So maybe with that, we can already shift over to the next presentation. So as I mentioned, we're a very dynamic coalition. So I will now be taking off my facilitator hat and passing it to Joanna, and I will jump into my presentation, which is on the industrial forestry model. So I'm sharing my screen. I hope that that you're able to see that okay. Can I get...
Yes.
Yes, it's all right. Okay, fantastic. So I didn't present myself properly in the beginning. I'm Kelsey Perlman. I'm a European forest campaigner at the association Fern. The presentation that I will talk to now isn't going to focus so much on offsetting. We have a lot of experts in the room that can speak to why offsets are not the right way to go. And as we kind of mentioned at the end of the last conversation, often the offset problem is obscuring a more fundamental problem within the industry. Hence why I wanted to outline a little bit the role of timber industries and the whole supply chain in policy and the way that that's particularly affecting climate policy. So I'll move on to my first slide. So I have worked on the land use change and forestry regulation for quite some years now. I think getting up to 10 years. And this is basically consisting of the emissions and the absorptions of carbon dioxide that come from the land use sector. The vast majority of the land use sink comes from forestry in the European Union. And what we've seen over time is that post-World War II, there was a massive amount of tree planting that was done to be able to generate timber. We had seen the carbon sink of forests growing over time. And now we have been seeing since around 2012 a very drastic decline in the entire LULUCF sink, as we call it. And this is mainly caused by forestry. So this is taken from greenhouse gas reporting data. When I produced this graph maybe 2 or 3 years ago, it was a 20% loss of carbon. But as we go on in time and we have later and later greenhouse gas data, we see that the decline is more and more steep over time. Now we're at a 33% loss of carbon that's absorbed by forest. And this is one of the reasons that the LULUCF target, which is one of the 3 pillars for achieving the EU's climate objectives, is not on track to be met across the European Union. So the first question that everyone needs to ask is, well, what's causing the decline? Currently, we don't have offsetting firmly established inside of the climate architecture. That's a discussion that's happening right now for the 2040 targets. But the reason that we are losing our land sink in Europe is mainly because of harvesting. When you look at different reports from the European Environmental Agency or other academic studies, you will usually see many different, let me see if I can grow the screen a little bit. Let's see. Can you see the slides here now? Can somebody confirm orally, because I'm trying to present full screen. You can see it? Okay, fantastic. So usually you'll see several different causes: harvesting, climate change impacts, slower sequestration rates, and that can make it sound very confusing when you read it. Well, is it actually droughts that are destroying the ability of carbon to be absorbed by our forests? Is it the fact that our forests are getting, older overall? It's very important to try and contextualize the causes of decline, and I think it's easier said simply. There's a report that came out in Nature Communications earlier this year, or maybe it was already a year and a half ago, which looked at what is the main sort of disturbance that we've been seeing over the past 30 years or so, and it is harvesting. So the most canopy openings and problems that we're seeing are resulting from tree harvesting that's due to resource extraction. And there is, of course, an interaction between the way that we manage, especially when it's very intensely, with the lack of resilience that forests have to climate change impacts like increasing droughts. So it's interesting to note that in the EU discussions about the climate targets and the fact that we are not meeting the climate targets for land, harvesting is very rarely mentioned as a cause, and yet it is a fundamental factor in why the land sink is declining. So then comes the question, well, how do we manage our forests? And it's a question that not a lot of countries or companies would like to show very clearly. So we have maybe every 5 years a report that looks at the state of forests across Europe. And usually what you see is a very unhelpful categorization of forests that you see at the top of this graph. So you see 3% semi-natural, 3% natural is what that should read, 89% semi-natural, and 8% plantations. So you might first see this figure and go, oh, only 8% of forests are monoculture plantations in Europe. But if you break down these figures, you'll see that it's actually a much different story that's being told. So if you add up the short rotation plantations for very high intensity forestry, where you're having sometimes 20 years only in between clearing and replanting, then you see planted forests. So yeah, also planting from seedlings and growing them only for timber production, so high intensity forestry, and then medium to high intensity forestry. Maybe the rotations are slightly longer, but it's definitely not the forest you imagine when you think of bedtime stories. Here you're looking at around 70% of forests that are intensively managed. And if you look to the other side of the chart, there are a lot of questions about the quality of the protected areas that we have. So the latest trends looking at the Natura 2000 areas across Europe have shown that there are a very small percentage of these forest lands that are actually in a good conservation status. So for the protected areas, we see that many things are protected on paper or not protected at all. We have some of the primary and old growth forests in Europe that are still not protected. And then on the other side of the equation, you have quite a heavy timber production model that is, of course, affecting the landscape across the EU. So these are just two pictures. I think images often speak louder than graphs. This was from a recent trip that we took to Finland. What you can see on the left-hand side is a forest that was shown to us by a conservationist who was showing us the old growth forest characteristics that you could see with certain lichen and moss that you find on the tree. And this other picture is from very, very close to this site where you see old growth forest values, where the landscape has been absolutely decimated. And it's this type of activity that we try to bring attention to, and we try to interrogate to see, are there other ways of producing timber that might be possible when you see that this is actually a very common way of managing forests throughout Europe, despite the fact that there are many stakeholders, foresters included, that would like to see support for other types of forest management practices, whether that's support for conservation or support for timber management that still looks like a forest when you're done with some of the wood harvesting. So then the question becomes, who are managing these forests? And the supply chain is very, very messy. It's very hard for me to try and do this across the EU 27, but perhaps in giving a Nordic example, it can give you an idea of the fact that there are many different actors operating in many different areas from owning all the way to producing timber that have quite an intensive impact on forestry across Europe. So landowners, I think often we imagine somebody in a plaid shirt, maybe with a chainsaw or even a small machine that's out in their forests. But the reality is there are lots of different types of forest owners, and the largest forest owner in Europe is SCA, which is a Swedish-owned company, and they own 2.6 million hectares of forest. So often we have to ask who is talking when we think about a forest owner speaking, because you actually have some quite large companies that own considerable amounts of land across forest. And then you also have sort of local forest owners associations. So in Sweden, that would be the Swedish Family Forest Owners. They're a member of the Forest Owners Lobby, CEPF, which is the Confederation of European Private Forest Owners. And many of these actors are talking often in terms of maintaining wood supply, which of course there are many different types of foresters that have many objectives that they want to promote. But in these cases, there are many that are focused on securing wood as a material for the industry. Then you have operators that work on the harvesting in the land. So you can see SCA is both a landowner and they also harvest and move the timber to where it's processed. So you have them and another group called Stora Enso, which is a Finnish-Swedish organized company. Then you can move to the processing, which will be the sawmills, where you see all of the stacks of timber that will be cut down into different sizes and then eventually given to stores. Once again, you see the same companies that are involved from ownership to harvesting to processing. And then when you get to distribution, you have groups that are more well-known, like IKEA, for example, where there have been recently many documentaries about the impact of this large company in terms of the timber demand that they have. So there's a lot of mixing. of these various actors. Quite often, it's a very integrated supply chain where you see many actors in control of many parts of the forestry process. And what are they saying? So they're saying a lot of things, but this is in relation to climate targets and achieving real zero. Some of the things that they are saying is that climate action should be less binding. So this is from a statement. I've put CEPF there, but there are actually many members across the supply chain that have signed up to a statement that has basically said the targets of LULUCF are quite strict. It's very hard for us to get to them, and we can see why. The amount of carbon being sequestered is less and less year on year, and harvesting is a main reason for that. So they've asked for, instead of legally binding climate targets with penalties, and we've seen that the penalties can be quite large for some countries, they need to make indicative, looser targets that they don't need to be held to. You can also see some examples of groups trying to leave voluntary initiatives as well. So there was the case of SEA, who wanted to pause their membership with FSC, which is a certification company that looks at the quality of timber management across Europe. And they basically said, well, if we're very bound by FSC, which has been a certification that has been quite heavily criticized for not being environmentally friendly enough. And we have a large industry group that has said, yeah, despite all of that, well, we might leave because we're not able to access enough timber. The situation has moved on since then, and they've started some negotiations, and they have said they're not going to leave. But I think that politically it's important to recognize that now there's challenges not just to binding legislation, but also to voluntary legislation that they've signed up to themselves. So this threatens climate goals. I just wanted to put up an example in the case of Finland. So on the left-hand side, we have the Finnish private forest owners, where you can see that they've put up some news about their successful advocacy leading to the rejection of monitoring forest better across Europe, where we would have been able to see things like harvesting trends, for example. They're also quite active in accelerating the development of nature credits, which is something that we're going to hear about in one of the next presentations. So you can see that instead of actually addressing binding climate targets to make sure that forests are absorbing more carbon, they're pushing against showing the harvesting that's happening across Europe, and they're heavily pushing the nature credits agenda, to the point that the business lobby in Finland pushed back against the forestry industry to say, we cannot challenge the climate targets that we have. It's going to fundamentally shake the climate architecture. So Finland needs to stick to our climate targets, because there are many front runners in business who have committed to saying that we're going to decarbonize. So I find this a very interesting dynamic, that you see other progressive industry actors basically telling the forestry industry, you need to meet the targets that are set there. We should not be rolling backwards. So this is a very interesting dynamic to continue to watch in the land use sector. So this is my last slide. What are we doing about it? So I hope for many of you on the line, especially if you're Brussels based, that you may be able to join us this Wednesday. There are many attacks to various legislation. So as I mentioned, the forest monitoring law was voted to be rejected by the European Parliament. We have challenges from industry to get rid of the LULUCF climate target for the land use sector. There's challenges to the EU deforestation regulation as well. And so we would like to come to Brussels with a variety of foresters and companies and citizens and civil society, and we'll meet at Place Luxembourg at 9 a.m. on Wednesday to basically show that there are many people that would like to protect our forests, and there is a vision of doing forestry differently and conserving landscapes as well better. So if you're in Brussels, then I highly encourage you to meet the Save Our Forest bus, which is coming your way from France. They're doing a tour right now, so I can also share some information about the trip that the bus is doing all the way up to Brussels. And with that, I will end my presentation and turn it back over to Joanna.
Thank you, Kelsey. Very interesting presentation. We already have some questions. I think Sherry has a few questions. I will go one by one, if that's okay with you, and then we'll you can answer each of them. So the first question is, should EU buyers of African carbon credits be subject to mandatory human rights due diligence under the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD, before making climate benefit claims? That's the first question.
So I mean, I can take them one by one. So I don't follow the CSDDD closely, but the core of this idea that everyone should be subject to due diligence to make sure that whatever they're claiming is the truth, I think is the way to go. So without talking about the quality of that directive, because I don't follow it, the concept of ensuring proper due diligence, I think, is one of the issues that is being heavily attacked. So I know the CSDDD has been attacked. This is also something demanded in the EUDR as well. So I would say absolutely.
Thank you, Kelsey. Okay, so the next question is, when industrial forestry projects like waste eucalyptus plantations emit more carbon over their life cycle than they store, shouldn't they be reclassified as carbon intensive rather than carbon neutral?
Yes, and I think this is a dangerous mistake sometimes that we see in forestry carbon accounting methodologies, where they for example, you're allowed to clear a standing forest and then put a plantation on top of it. And some of the methodologies don't actually take into account that first harvesting. And so they still issue credits when something is much more carbon intensive. So I would say, yes, from all the way down to the technical level of poorly made methodologies, all the way up to the activities that we should actually be promoting, this type of activity should be classified as carbon intensive.
Thank you. And the last question from Sherry is, what global accountability mechanism beyond national courts can protect African and indigenous communities from green grabs justified by offset language?
I don't feel that I'm the one that can offer the best answer to this question, but laws.
Yeah, I could, if you want, I could add, like, there is much courts that are holding up offset projects or project developers accountable. We are seeing one in Kenya, one in Colombia, one in Peru. So there are possibilities to hold project developers accountable for what they do on the territories, although it's very difficult and it is very resource intensive. So, I also am not a lawyer to say what are the possibilities, but I could say that there are opening more and more possibilities, and this make corporates more afraid, I would say, to enter this industry because of the liability that they can hold after a project gets, prosecuted. Okay, there is another question. I will take the one from Carla first, and then we can go back to Cheryl. She has other questions. Oh, wait, no, this was not really a question. It was something on the sound. I hope that that's already working. And there is for Kelsey and for Joanna, credibility and metrics. There are multiple views that say that GGW is far off track, only 30% complete, more or less, and faces major financing bottlenecks despite large pledges. From your vantage point on EU forest climate policy, is the GGW still a credible flagship, or has it become a fundraising narrative masking delivery gaps?
I have not followed the GGW.
Yeah, I also think that this goes into a very specific, narrative. I would not be able to say if it has become a fundraising narrative. To be honest, I don't follow it also to the dot.
I can speak to the EU funding
Okay.
landscape because that is an area where we just recently did an investigation to try and see how money was distributed in the forestry sector. And so I think it's probably a similar narrative to what we see at the international level, which is there is a lot of money that's going into forestry, but often it's harmful subsidies or even subsidies with a mixed impact. So we saw for the EU, when you look at agriculture, it's about 36 billion, and forestry is around 5 billion or so. So much smaller, but still important. It's often said that there are no subsidies in forestry, which is flat out incorrect. And so there's a lot of questions now about very tight budgets that exist in the EU, which I'm sure is also a similar narrative that we're hearing elsewhere. And yet, based on this sort of preliminary investigation, we see that there's a lot that can be done in redirecting national portfolios into programs that work, and we have some examples for that. So I can share the report that we've done in the chat because I'm sure there's a lot of parallels with international climate finance and EU climate finance. And yeah.
Great. Thank you. And I think one last one, although Sherry has many questions, which I would suggest that she could also send some by email, or we'll see if we have more time at the end. But one last one could be, what counts as restoration? Which I found an interesting question. Official updates cite tens of millions of hectares restored, but methodologies lump together diverse activities and sometimes over credit tree planting. So what minimum standards should the EU accept for counting restorations to avoid greenwashing?
So a lot of it is laid out in the nature restoration law. The bulk of restoration in the European Union is linked with the Birds and Habitats Directive. So it's about having favorable conservation status, which, as I mentioned in my presentation, the current conservation status for forests is very low. There's 15% of all of the EU protected areas that are in good status. So a big part of the restoration effort will be moving those areas into favorable conservation status. And then there's a second part of the legislation for forestry that requires an improvement of 6 or so metrics of biodiversity across a country. So there needs to be better deadwood, a difference in structural diversity, an increase in forest birds. There's a list of various indicators that need to be improved, and that does allow for more marginal improvements where you're still managing for timber, for example, but you're moving away from plantation forestry into something like continuous cover forestry or selective thinning. So there are some more details in that legislation. It is not perfect, and I will highlight that there are some actions that allow for non-native species to be planted if it can be argued that it's good for fighting against climate change. So there are always loopholes that can exist, but I do think that the legislation is being attacked currently because it is pushing for restoring a lot of the landscapes. So I would point you to the nature restoration regulation text to see how that's defined in Europe.
Thank you, Kelsey. I think because of time and because we have to go into a lot of topics today, I will now please ask Almuth to join us. Almuth Ernsting, she's from Biofuelwatch, and she will tell us all about the biochar and that methodology.
Yes, sorry, one moment. I just got to get my camera back. One
No worries.
Yes. Okay, I think that's better. Right. Yes, no, let me find my presentation now. One moment about Biochar. Hang on. Biochar. There we go. And whoops, make it slideshow. Okay, right. Sorry about that. Can you, yeah, you can see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, excellent. So yeah, let me start right away. So it's basically a quick and dirty way to in future get currently voluntary CDR carbon offsets, and in future likely under the CF more carbon offsets, whilst wasting wood and other biomass. Just to say why, biochar is really important in the context of the, discussing European policy is that the two first methodologies for under the CRCF that have been proposed in detail are on the one hand for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which is incredibly expensive and nobody's really managed to do this at scale and probably won't, in my view, and biochar, secondly. So they are the most advanced methodologies that have already been consulted on detail, hence the focus on biochar today. Now, going back to basics, what is biochar? It's basically a fancy word for charcoal, except that the word charcoal is normally only used for char made from wood, and biochar can be used for charcoal made from any types of biomass. Originally, the term was only used for char that is added to soils in the based on the idea that it increases soil carbon and sequesters soil carbon. We'll get into that in a bit. But now the term biochar is being thrown around quite widely. It's used for charcoal fed to cattle, yes, seriously, and also for char used in materials, even road buildings, all sorts of things. But I'm going to focus on the main, what the methodology is mostly about, which is really carbon biochar charcoal added to soils. Now, before we get into this whole debate about carbon and biochar, just want to explain one other term, and that's the term black carbon, which is the carbon in biochar that we are actually talking about. So black carbon is basically the elemental carbon that you get from incomplete burning or incomplete combustion of biomass or fossil fuels. So coal and both coal and biochar contain, or charcoal, biochar, coal contain black carbon, as do wildfire residues. And small particles of black carbon are called soot. So yeah, this is all basically black carbon, and that's what people are talking about. And it's very important because a lot of the claims made about the carbon in biochar lasting forever in soils basically is actually based on studies that involved black carbon from wildfires, which is the main source of black carbon in soils, obviously, and sadly very much an increasing one. Okay, one thing that it is not, that biochar is absolutely not, and that you may have heard where there's a lot of the advocates of large-scale biochar use speaking about, those amazing soils found in the Amazon basin called terra preta, which is a term for black earth. It is basically not that, right? So a lot of the advocacy for adding charcoal to soils has been based on those amazing soils. They date back to pre-colonial indigenous agroecological systems, garden cities of the Amazons. And those practices are only partly understood, but we know that they involved middens, compost, fish bones, human manure, clay shards, and charcoal probably from people throwing the remains of their cooking fires into, mixing that into their middens and then applying it to the soils. So just to show you an example, this is archaeological mapping of those amazing systems, what remains today, what we can see today from the pre-colonial times, and then a typical pyrolysis plants. And no, they have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with each other. So let's just not even get there. Another thing about, important to say is biochar isn't one product. Whatever char you make varies hugely depending on the temperature you make it at, how you make it. Those are just different. Just how hugely it varies seen under a microscope. and also what type of feedstock you use, totally different. So there's nothing you can say about biochar that is true, universally true. Nor is there anything universally true about applying anything whatsoever to soils, because you have thousands of different soil types. So there's nothing you can say that doing this to all the soils is going to do X, Y, Z, right? And another complication is that, not only do we have different soil types, but we've got soil microbes that interact, that actually regulate the soil carbon and nutrient cycles, and they are home to potentially the majority of species on Earth are soil microbes. Likely the majority of all species known on Earth are actually living in soils. Okay, now, what about those claims? This is maybe a wee bit technical, but so I'm just going to shorten it. What we know is that in the short term, adding any source of carbon, including biochar, to soil can either increase the amount of carbon in that soil, or it can feed those microbes that just decompose and emit the existing soil organic carbon. So it can be a good or bad thing, right? It's nothing universally true. Similarly to true for the medium term and long term, well, we don't have long-term studies about biochar. The longest ones are just a few years, and otherwise you're speaking about just wildfire residues. And there the findings are pretty much all over the place. Okay, soil fertility, again, adding biochar can be good for crops, bad for crops, not make a difference. Again, completely mixed picture. Okay, one really big concern about, large-scale use of biochar especially, and using this, which is actually fascinating because in the EU, some people seem to have listened to that, yay, is that it's the danger of toxins. So if you have incomplete combustion, you have toxins forming, which is why, for example, that is the main reason why it's a bad, it's not very advisable to eat burnt toast a lot, right? You get toxins from char. And these are particularly formed at the kind of temperatures which you need to make a lot of char, right? So charcoal product, if you want to, your aim is to use wood and get the maximum amount of char from it, then you're gonna have those toxins forming. Biochar proponents claim that they are stable, but there's no evidence on that long term. Unfortunately, so far the EU hasn't brought that. But it's a big issue in this debate, is that potentially if you have large-scale biochar use, you could poison your land and you could poison your food. Okay, so what's proposed at the moment in the proposed CRCF methodology? Big win by the industry lobby so far, especially if that gets adopted, as is, we fear it will be in its current. I fear it's certainly not going to get any better. Is that there is no requirement to test soil carbon. You're not going to say, over the next 5 or 10 years you have to see whether after you put that char into soil there's actually going to be any more carbon than beforehand. Oh no, they don't. That's not going to happen. So it's all a guessing game. Then they're applying the same inadequate sustainability and greenhouse gas criteria that apply from the Renewable Energy Directive to biomass energy. What that basically says is, yes, you can source your char by clear cutting forests, and you can source it from industrial tree or crop plantations. And never mind the impacts of the logging, feeding into, the loss of the carbon sinks that Kelsey just spoke about, happening increasingly for biomass energy too. Never mind, the climate impact of industrial agriculture, industrial tree plantations. No, anything you do with that feedstock is going to be carbon negative. The one good thing is that right now the proposal is to actually test for biochar for toxins. That's, one good thing, but against all the rest, it's, you know, it's still really, really dreadful news if this happens, if this gets rubber stamped. Okay, so what does that mean in practice? So fortunately, we've just heard from a colleague of Kelsey said this sea project seems to be on hold at the moment, but has been a proposal in the French Pyrenees by a startup company called Miraya that was speaking about building 6 or 7 biochar plants, pyrolysis plants. They want to use wood from whole trees cut down in those biodiverse forests. And sorry about the typing errors here, biodiverse. Right now, that seems to be on hold, we've been told, because it's not yet profitable. But if this biochar gets into the CSCF gets approved, and in the worst cases ultimately gets into the EU emissions trading scheme, then, you know, basically forest destruction schemes like this for biochar will become profitable. That's a real danger. Another one that we are seeing, sort of, I saw that just the other day, is from a town in Germany where a company somewhere in Saxony is building a biomass plant, and they're going to use pyrolysis to make, you know, rather than bog standard combustion. So that on top of their plan is that on top of generating heat and power and getting money for that, they're also getting additional money by selling carbon credits for the char that is produced together with heat and power. Big concern, because they are going to use, if it goes ahead, they will use also wood from native, either from native forests or from those plantations, so old plantations in parts of East Germany, but one way or another contributing to the destruction of forests and the ongoing destruction of Germany's carbon sink. Germany no longer has a carbon sink because to large part overlogging. And then the last example I have is in will there be more information coming out, I'm sure, but so far there was a study, a report in Repórter Brasil investigation about a really huge project in Minas Gerais in Brazil, where a company that makes charcoal for steel production, Aperam, sorry if it's pronounced different, but Aperam is now also selling carbon offsets for charcoal as biochar to earn additional carbon credits. That's made from those huge eucalypt plantations. There's a picture of them surrounding a small farmer's property from Repórter Brasil, the picture. And the irony is that they are marketing this as a way, the biochar Aperam is marketing it as a way to have water retention in the soil, and yet the eucalypt plantations are drying up the lands on which, and the water sources on which local communities rely for their livelihoods. So really dreadful. Expect to see more of that, sadly. Feared impact if this gets into the CSCF and especially into EU ETS, EU emissions trading scheme. There'll be more pressure on forests, more forest degradation, more incentives for monoculture plantations, trees, certainly trees, maybe also crops. There is a risk, and that those decisions haven't been made yet, but there is a risk that if it gets into EU ETS, it will count if the charcoal is imported from the global south and applied in Europe, used in Europe. It's actually relatively cheap. It's cheaper shipping charcoal than it is shipping logs or even wood pellets, because it's more dense. And then more logging, more land conversions make climate change even worse, as well as being a disaster for communities and for biodiversity. And that's me.
Thank you very much, Almuth. Some very worrying developments around biochar that should definitely be pushed back against in the discussion of the upcoming revision of the EU ETS and the finalization of methodologies under the carbon removal certification framework. So I see that, there's a comment, biochar is not what they say it is. So I have a question from my side. I think I know the answer, but sometimes the simple questions are good to sort of bury the message home. there was the quite scary statement that good biochar requires low temperatures that can poison land and food. So what is the good in this statement?
Not so much. It's methods that are good for maximizing biochar production. So when you have high temperatures, you get more energy and you get very, very little char. So, for example, very high temperatures, maybe only 10% of the carbon in the biomass ends up in the biochar. So you would need, that's not very good for earning huge amounts of carbon offsets, basically. And at the moment in the voluntary markets, there is right now no testing for soil, no testing at all happening for those toxins.
Okay, I'm glad I clarified then. Good for maximizing production. I didn't know if it had to do with like the water retention or something else they would argue about the quality.
Quantities. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's fine. Yes, I'm still seeing I'm not seeing specific questions on biochar. Maybe we can, no testing for biotoxins. We have a lot of shock in the comments, which makes a lot of sense. Maybe the last question that I would have before I bring our next presenter in would be in terms of political interventions. When is the sort of next moment to mobilize around the biochar issue? Is it the ETS revision? Is it a CRCF methodology?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I mean, the CRCF methodology consultation has finished. I mean, we put in a big input, and there was also a joint NGO letter that I know Fern and also us and various other NGOs signed, critiquing the methodology and the one for BECS. I'm not aware right now. I mean, I'm not Brussels-based. I'm not aware of any opportunities right now to influence the CRCF further. But keeping the CRCF completely out of EU ETS is going to be massively important with regards to biochar, but also I think all the other things we've been talking about, in the land sector that are dreadful. So I think that's going to have to be a really, really big battle.
Yeah, thank you for that, Almuth. And maybe we can also share the sign-on for the participants of the webinar so they can look into that in more detail to really understand the inner workings of the CRCF. And with that, thank you very much, Almuth, for that presentation, which will be circulated. And now I will go over to Frederic Hache, who has all the information on biodiversity offsets and will educate us on what to be scared about. Go ahead, Frederic.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So what are biodiversity credits or nature credits, which is something we've heard quite a lot in Brussels over the past few months, and what is the forthcoming market on nature? So biodiversity credits are defined as positive contributions to conservation that include avoided destruction, but also restoration actions. If I take an example, let's say you have a company who wants to build an airport over a flamingo habitat in the south of France. We have three cases. The first case is traditional environmental regulation, where the company will be told, well, no, you need to do your airport somewhere else. The second case is classic biodiversity offsetting, where the company will be told, okay, you can do your airport terminal, but you need to recreate a habitat for flamingos within, say, 10 kilometers. Even though in reality, we know that we're unable in most cases to comprehensively recreate all the ecosystemic functions that we have destroyed. And there's a third option, which is an extreme version of biodiversity offsetting, where the company will be told, okay, you can do your airport terminal, but you need to compensate not within 10 kilometers, but somewhere in Europe or somewhere in the world, and not necessarily by recreating the same type of habitat and species that was destroyed. So in theory, you could destroy a flamingo habitat in the south of France and recreate a bat habitat in Greece, and under this, the destruction would have been considered to be offset. And of course, in reality, we all know that more bats do not equal less flamingos. So in a nutshell, biodiversity offsetting is exactly the same as carbon offsetting, except that it's infinitely more complicated. Because in one case, you have 6 main greenhouse gases and equivalencies between them that are, well, there are margins of errors, but are more or less known and stable. And so we trade one asset, right, on the market, we trade the ton of CO2 equivalent. So the equivalence between the different gases kind of hold, but here we're talking about millions of species linked between them by a complex network of interdependencies, and it's simply not possible to standardize and oversimplify that into a few liquid tradable assets, right? Which is required to create a market. If you create a market, you cannot have millions of different types of credits, of offsets. It's just not the way market work. You need to have 1, 2, 3, perhaps 4 or 5 at the most type of credits. And so that requires a level of oversimplification that is absolutely incompatible, in my opinion, with environmental integrity. And the reason, and what is really interesting is that we know, I mean, there is a debate on whether credits are equal to offset or not. We know that credits will be used mostly as offsets. In fact, the debate is a moot point. We know that. Why? We know that, first of all, because there is no other business case at scale. What that means is that you may have a few voluntary purchases from philanthropic foundations, from companies trying to green their image, but that's not enough. That's not enough to create a fully functional market. And we also know that the EU keeps on claiming for now, and it will claim probably as long as it can, that nature credits, its credits are totally different from offsets. They will not be used for offsetting purposes. But in fact, the EU has published a roadmap a few months ago who already states that nature credits will come after offsets, thereby legitimizing them. And the last thing is that there is a major international initiative that is backed by the French government, the UK government, the World Economic Forum, and the UN to launch a global biodiversity credit market. And they already stated that their credits can be used for offsetting. And of course, there's a lot of pressure on the EU to try and align with this framework. So for all these reasons, credits will most likely be used as offsets. And so that's why I would use the term interchangeably, like it's the same thing. And yet, there is a scientific consensus on the fact that biodiversity offsetting is impossible in most cases. And that's because our scientific knowledge is very incomplete, right? I mean, we still discover on average 18,000 species per year. And I think we have mapped or taxonomied only 20% of species. And that means that you cannot create a market that's something you don't even understand, that you don't have the full picture of. It's just simply preposterous to claim that you will offset if you do not understand the species, therefore do not understand their interactions, etc. And the other reason why biodiversity offsetting is considered to be not possible in most cases is because the science of restoration is in its infancy, and it's extremely complicated, costly, it takes a lot of time. And so that explains why biodiversity offsetting has had such a poor track record. Because this is not a new idea at all. It has been in existence for 4 decades. I mean, it started in the 80s in the US with habitat banks, then in the 19s in Canada, and then in Australia later. So this is really nothing new, and it's failed. The reality is most offset projects failed, and that's not really surprising once we understand the limitations of our scientific knowledge. So we know that biodiversity offsetting will have major environmental integrity issues. In fact, I mean, it will not have satisfying integrity issues. So it will fail environmentally. And we also know that it will most likely create the same social issues as carbon offsetting, namely land grabbing and human rights abuses, predominantly in the global south. Why? Simply because that's it's a combination of reasons, but it's they have not destroyed their biodiversity to the extent that we have, and also obviously land is far cheaper there, whereas land here is considered too important for urbanization and other uses. So I said that biodiversity offsetting is not new. What is new, however, is the clear political intent that started a few years ago to create a really fully fledged financial market on biodiversity credits and offsets. And that's really different. That's also much different from what's happening in the carbon offset space, because carbon offsets are mostly voluntary, whereas here there is this intention to create a regulatory market. What that means is that there would be a legal obligation for companies to buy these credits. And of course, that means you have demand that is guaranteed by law. And of course, that means the market could scale much faster and become much larger. Now, this is a financialization and a privatization of conservation policy, right? Because what we're talking about here, we're talking about transferring from the public sphere, from the government and environmental policies in charge of protecting biodiversity. We're transferring that to private markets. We're transferring that to private investors who would be the one expected to pay for restoration projects in the future, expected to fund them, expected also to pay for avoided destruction. And that's extremely problematic because it would introduce potentially a profitability requirement. To put it another way, it means that in the future, if we do privatize our conservation policies, it means that they have to be constantly profitable for private investors to constantly fund them. Otherwise, they could just simply stop funding them. And of course, that would make our conservation policies much weaker compared to environmental policies, conservation policies based on regulation. And the other thing is that we're talking about the transfer of sovereignty from the state to financial markets, because these markets will determine the price of the different types of credits. They will determine which type of projects get undertaken or not. And it is quite unlikely that ecological priorities will match financial markets priorities. In fact, we already have an example of that in the UK, where they started such a market in 2024. And last time I checked, there was a massive focus from financial market sector on one type of credit, which was, I think it was modified grassland. Probably it was the cheapest, it was the fastest to work, etc. But of course, we all know that's not how nature works. You cannot pick and choose what type of credits you prefer. So we know that these markets will be an environmental failure. We know that they will most likely create massive social risk. And why are they then being promoted, knowing all of that? So there are several reasons put forward. I spoke to the Commission a few days ago, and they said, well, if we try to put environmental regulation instead of market, we will have too many loopholes, etc. That's not a very convincing reason for me. But the main reason that we hear is that of a funding gap, right? We are told that the main reason why we keep on destroying our biodiversity and we're unable to stop that is because we would not have enough money for conservation policies. And we are told that this funding gap, that is the figure that is thrown around frequently is around 700 billion annually, is far too big for governments to possibly close this funding gap. And that consequently, we need to redirect private capital. And that the best option to redirect private capital is through the creation of a whole new financial market on a whole new pseudo commodity that would be biodiversity credits. And yet, when you look at it, this narrative is absolutely not self-evident, and in fact, it's arguably debatable, but also politically biased, right? I mean, first of all, there is a funding gap. I mean, lack of funding for conservation policies is a reality, but that's one of many issues. That is not the main issue. It's one of many issues. I mean, there's also a lack of environmental regulation that would be aligned with science, but of course, that goes unmentioned. Secondly, this funding gap could be easily closed by redirecting a fraction of the existing subsidies to harmful activities that are estimated by the UN to 1,700 billion annually. What that means is that there is absolutely no need for private capital. The state could totally close the funding gap without increasing its budget issues, increasing its debt, raising taxes, or anything. So there is absolutely no need for private capital. That is a political choice. That's what I'm getting at. But so let's say we make a political choice to continue subsidizing massively biodiversity destruction because it's probably good for jobs in some sectors and for the re-election of certain policymakers. Well, still, if we wanted to redirect private capital, the best option, the most effective and the fastest option to do that would be via environmental regulation. Why? Because any regulation, by definition, will impact the future expected profits of the sectors involved, right? And private investors will adjust mechanically their investment to the new profit expectations. But even if we make a political choice to say, nah, that's too coercive, it's too coercive for business, we want to use only the carrot and not the stick. Well, still then, we would have much simpler, faster options, such as favorable tax treatments, favorable regulatory treatments, etc., that would still be arguably much faster and simpler than creating a whole new financial infrastructure for a whole new asset. And so what I'm getting at is that this creating a financial markets and biodiversity credits is arguably the last and the least effective option if the goal is to protect biodiversity. It is, and so this is really a narrative more than anything else to justify that. And it's a narrative also that, surprise, surprise, will empower the same actors that caused the destruction in the first place and empower the financial sector. And so for all these reasons, we know that these biodiversity credits, there's a formula that I quite like. It said that just like carbon offsets, they're likely to be both an environmental failure and a political success, in the sense that the real goal, as we understand it, is in reality to protect the status quo for a few more years. It's not about protecting biodiversity, it's protecting vested interests, it's about refusing to challenge our existing paradigm, the way we live and the way we work. I mean, much has been written in political science about that, and in this sense, it's very similar to climate politics, where arguably carbon offsets from the very beginning aimed at wasting a few decades to protect profit in a few areas. And so, I mean, the way to understand biodiversity credits, they don't make sense from an environmental perspective. They do not make sense from an economic perspective. They only make sense from a political perspective. And to phrase it another way, it's just merely reflects the fact that the overarching political priorities are short-term growth and competitiveness, and that addressing the ecological crisis comes after that. That's another way of saying exactly the same thing. And much has been written about that. Bruno Latour, the French philosopher, explained that by makes the assumption of a secession of the elites. It's pretty much that everybody has given up at the top, saying, well, it's too much, it's too big, it's too complicated, each to their own. So they're just trying to save as much as they can while it's still possible and running for the lifeboats on the Titanic, while biodiversity credits are equivalent to telling the orchestra to play a lullaby so that the popular classes do not panic too fast. So that's pretty much the way we understand it. And what is interesting is that there's nothing new about it. So we have a lot of data. I mean, I mentioned earlier, we have data on the appalling track record of this. We have a lot of data on the politics of it. And yet the European Commission and others act like this never happened. We do not have this data. We do not have this research. It's something new. And oh, surprise, surprise, it's a shiny new thing that is aimed at diverting attention from the need for tighter environmental regulations that would be more aligned with science and address the crisis. So it's really about, yeah, in this sense, this is another false solution. And we are today on biodiversity where we were on carbon probably 15 years ago. Now, where do we stand? What is the state of play? Where are we today? Well, we have the UK who has launched such a market in 2024. It's basically a market for real estate and infrastructure developers. It's a regulatory market, so that means that if they want to build a new development on an area where the habitat is degraded, they have to offset their residual destruction in order to obtain their building permit. What is quite interesting is that there's a plot twist. That we are now only 1.5 years after they launched this market, and already there was a government attempt to kind of scrap this whole market because, yeah, you know what, it's still too cumbersome for real estate developers. It's such a hurdle for them. So maybe what about they just do a one-off payment into a conservation fund? And that's really interesting because by doing that, they show exactly also another risk, which is a regulatory risk for any project developers who would be willing to get into that field, for any private investor, but also for any farmer that might be enticed to accept the revenues from the sale of these biodiversity credits. I mean, we know that in the case of the EU, for example, one of the big perks of this market, in their view, is that they intend to drastically curb agricultural subsidies in the PAC review, in the CAP review, and trying to sell to agriculture to farmers that, don't worry, you'll get the sale of nature credits instead. And of course, it's not quite the same. We're talking about potentially highly hypothetical and volatile revenues. Aside from the UK, we have a major initiative that I mentioned earlier, which is IATP, which is essentially the French and UK governments, and have joined forces now with the World Economic Forum and McKinsey Sustainability and the Biodiversity Credit Alliance, which is from the UN. And they published at the end of last year, during the COP16 in Cali, their framework for high integrity biodiversity credits. And so we have quite a bit of info on what they have in mind, and it's absolutely not high integrity. We can already say that, first of all, because A, the credits can be used as offsets, that's stated on black on white. B, well, we do not have the equivalence, of course, where they have to be determined later. They authorize the ex-ante sale of credits. What that means is that you can, if you start a restoration project, you can start selling credits immediately, not after some positive impact has been measured and certified. And that's obviously not really high integrity, but that's good for starting a market. And they have even softer additionality requirement than for carbon because they have three categories. They have uplift, avoided loss, and maintenance. So essentially you have restoration, you have avoided loss, but you have a third one, which is maintenance, which is avoided restoration for areas that are not under any short-term threat. Avoided destruction, sorry. So this is really poor in terms of impact and additionality. And also there is a big focus on IPLC involvement, which suggests, or the way we understand it, that an intent to go big after IPLC land. And of course, there is, I mean, it would be very surprising if it would be otherwise. I mean, they go for where land is cheapest, as usual. In the European Union, we're pretty much, I mean, Ms. van der Leyen has called for the creation of a market to restore our planet that will trade nature credits. We have much less info at this stage. We just have a roadmap. Like I said, the Commission so far claims officially that credits will not be used as offsets, but in private meetings, they acknowledge that, well, we don't know what will be the final outcome. As for the geographical scope, we do not know if the biodiversity credits will be limited to EU, but the fact that they have a pilot project taking place in Peru suggests that maybe not necessarily. Surprise, surprise. And it would likely be a compliance market where they could use, for example, the recent mandatory restoration targets and try to shift them from member state level to individual company level. And this way you create a market with demand guaranteed by law. Boom. And lastly, there's an uncertainty on whether a nature credit will only be biodiversity or biodiversity plus, such as it could be a new umbrella term for carbon offsetting biodiversity and also potentially a water pollution market, as already exists in the UK. So right now, where we are is that, well, there's an expert group that is being set up by the Commission, and we expect a legislative proposal, I think, in 2027. The good news is that the train has not left the station. I mean, it's far from a done deal. There is a strong reluctance from corporates to engage into it. They've been kind of burned with carbon offsetting. They really find it a bit shifty and aware of reputational risks. So that's good news. And the good news is also that, I mean, I take comfort in the fact that we are already the majority. I mean, if you look at most surveys, what do they tell you? I mean, recent surveys show that whether in rich countries or globally, the majority of citizens want more ambitious climate policy. They are willing to change the way they work and they live to make that happen. But the surveys also show that they typically tend to think that they're a minority because probably they're being told that they're a minority. And so what that means is there's no need to convince the vested interests that stand to lose. There's no need to convince policymakers that have no intention of being convinced. We just need to raise awareness. Once people realize that we are already a majority and they start to unite, we can reach a critical mass and make change happen. And I will stop here.
Thanks, Frederic. That's a great point to add on. There are many people who think climate action is necessary. Also love to hear the point on there is money out there. Subsidy reform is could be easy if we could get over the political hurdle. So maybe that's another call to get out to Brussels on Wednesday. Sorry, I'll take that opportunity.
On the money front also, I mean, let's remember that, we keep on being told that there is no magic money tree, right? But there's no magic money tree except when we want to find magic money, such as the 2008 bank bailout, the COVID recovery package, or the massive increase in EU defense spending.
Yes. So we can find the money when we want to find the money. So I see that there are a lot of quite technical questions from Sherry, which I would suggest that we follow up with in writing. But I do want to maybe combine a question I have with one of the questions that she's laid out back to Fred. Is if the moral right to offset is based on historic overconsumption, should companies be required to disclose the social costs of their offsets, identifying who bears the ecological and social risk? So that's one question she has. And then I would add a question based off your presentation, which is, why is the offset model more attractive for companies than paying for the sort of like philanthropy, basically? If you can give some color to those.
The first question, I mean, from where I stand, given all the documented evidence on the issues with offsetting, right? I would not even engage in the sense, I don't want to talk about safeguards. I don't want to talk about making it work better because it's so out there. It's so impossible. It's so impossible to make it work, frankly, that even social safeguards or etc. or disclosure for me would never address sufficiently the issue. I mean, we've seen with carbon also, what's happening. I mean, and it was mentioned earlier. I mean, offsets are licensed to continue to destroy even more. Look at what's happening with civil aviation emissions, right? The aviation lobby expects aviation emissions to triple by 2050, thanks to offsetting. Because why not? So companies should really refrain from engaging, especially because what we have seen also with the Green Claims Directive and other trials, I mean, the risks are far from neglectable, whether reputational, but also, as I mentioned earlier, regulatory risk. I mean, they should not underestimate the fact that any policy based on short-sighted political momentum is likely to change with the next government. And that's not necessarily something you want to, something to keep in mind. And sorry about your question, why do companies want to offset?
It was more about, you raised a question that offsetting is a model at scale. And so there's more interest in always using a credit for an offset as opposed to just results-based finance, for example. So I was wondering why that is.
So from a corporate perspective, the way I say it, why would a company spend money on an offset, right? You have to ask yourself. You can spend a little money, right, for your CSR department and to try to pep talk your employees and have a great, retreat, whatever. But that's never going to be massive. I mean, I'm guessing you'll never spend that much money that you spend on your corporate lobbying. The only reason why you want to buy these credits is because you know that they can be instrumentalized to prevent tighter environmental regulation that in certain areas would drastically cut your sales and your profit. That's the way. I mean, we had leaked memo in the process because these offsets do not come in addition to tighter environmental legislation. The whole point, the whole reason of being is that they come instead of. So otherwise, and in this case, like all right, I'm willing to spend a lot more money for that because what's at stake is a lot more important to my bottom line.
Very helpful. So I think with that, I will move into the conclusions. So as we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, all of the presentations and the webinar recording itself will be shared. I do suggest to all of the panelists that we take any of the open questions and that we respond to that after the fact. But I do want to give a very warm thank you to all of the panelists. We heard that offsets, whether they are abroad or whether they are in the agriculture sector or the forestry sector or whether they're applied to biodiversity, they are riddled with the same problems or even get compounding problems depending on the detail of the problem that we're attempting to address, like biodiversity. I think there was a good quote on attempting to simplify biodiversity does not work. And this often hides the fact that there are companies and industrial models out there that need to be fundamentally changed. And this is done through strong regulation, which I think is an important message to hear in a time where there are many policymakers that would like to get rid of environmental regulation, whether it's the CSDDD that was mentioned earlier, or the EUDR, nature restoration targets, or even the climate architecture, which is one of the main reasons that Real Zero Europe has come together, which is to try and continue effective climate action in all of the sectors that we cover. There is a real need to hear the voices of those that want to see real change on the ground to address climate change and the biodiversity crisis. So this was very helpful to get some insight into these issues. I hope it's also been helpful for you, the audience, as well. So please reach out to any of us with any follow-up questions, especially as it relates to EU and international climate policy. And with that, I think I will say thank you for your attention and look forward to continuing the conversation in other formats. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good evening.